I buried my husband yesterday. Will you marry me today? That's what the widow asked the giant cowboy, right at the grave, in front of the whole town. Folks froze. No one knew why she'd ask a man like that, and not a soul dared to guess what she was really fighting for. But when a woman's got nothing left to lose, she'll do whatever it takes to protect what matters. And that cowboy? He carries a past that could break a man or save a town. Before the dust settles, vows will be tested, and when the law comes knocking, someone's going to learn. Out here, a promise means more than a signature. The only question is, who's brave enough to stand with her? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments, share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The autumn wind rustled through the cemetery's oak trees, scattering golden leaves across the fresh-turned earth. Mary Jane Thatcher stood straight-backed before her husband's grave, her black veil rippling like a dark flag in the breeze. The mourners huddled close, their whispered condolences floating past her like leaves on the wind. At the edge of the gathering, Boone Taggart's tall figure cast a long shadow across the graves. His weathered face bore the scars of hard years, but his eyes held a gentle watchfulness as they followed the widow's quiet strength. He'd positioned himself apart from the others, as was his custom, his broad shoulders hunched against both the wind and the sideways glances of the townspeople. Reverend Matthew's voice carried across the cemetery as he delivered the final prayer. We commit Thomas Thatcher's body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life. Mary Jane's gloved hands clutched a handful of earth. She stepped forward, scattering it across the polished pine of her husband's coffin. The soft patter of dirt on wood seemed to echo in the stillness. The mourners began to drift away in twos and threes, their black-clad figures winding between the headstones like crows taking flight. Mary Jane remained, her shoulders straight despite the weight of her grief. Then, with purpose in her step, she turned and walked directly toward Boone Taggart. The remaining onlookers paused, watching as the widow approached the solitary cowboy. Boone shifted uncomfortably, his large hands working at the brim of his hat. Mary Jane drew close enough that her veil nearly brushed his chest. I buried my husband yesterday, she whispered, her voice steady despite the shocking words that followed. Will you marry me today? A gasp rippled through the lingering mourners. Mrs. Henderson clutched her chest, while old Mr. Peterson nearly dropped his walking stick. Boone's face registered surprise, his usual stoic expression cracking for just a moment. Ma'am, he began, but words failed him. Mary Jane stood her ground, her veiled face tilted up toward his. The scandal of her request hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Several of the townswomen began whispering furiously behind their handkerchiefs. Without speaking further, Boone offered his arm. Mary Jane took it, and together they walked toward her waiting wagon, leaving the shocked murmurs behind them. Their boots crunched on the gravel path, a steady rhythm that seemed to measure out the weight of the moment. When they reached the wagon, Mary Jane's voice came low and urgent. The railroad's given notice. If I'm not married by sundown tomorrow, they'll seize the ranch. The contract Thomas signed... Her voice caught. It specified a married householder must work the land. Boone's weathered face showed understanding dawn. His eyes moved to the distant hills where Mary Jane's ranch lay, then back to her face, still hidden behind the veil. Those fields feed half the territory, she continued. And the Ute family that winters in the north pasture, they'd lose their promised grazing rights. Thomas gave his word they'd always have a place there. The big man's hands tightened on his hat brim. That's a mighty burden you're carrying, Mrs. Thatcher. Mary Jane, she corrected softly. And yes, it is. But I mean to honor both my husband's promises and the land itself. She straightened her shoulders. I know what people will say about this proposal. I know it ain't proper, but I'm asking for your help, Mr. Taggart, because you're a man who understands about promises and land. Boone looked down at his boots, scuffed and dusty from the cemetery path. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "This needs some thinking on, Mum. If you'll permit, I'll ride out to your place before nightfall. We can talk more then." Mary Jane nodded, accepting his careful answer. Boone helped her up onto the wagon seat, his strong hand steady and respectful. As she gathered the reins, she looked down at him one last time. "I'll have coffee ready," she said simply. Boone stepped back, watching as she turned the wagon toward home. The afternoon sun caught in her veil, making the black fabric transparent for just a moment. Behind it, her face showed not grief or desperation, but the quiet determination of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The townsfolk were still watching, clustering in small groups to share their shock at the day's events. Boone paid them no mind as he walked to where his horse was tethered. He had some hard thinking to do before sunset, and the weight of Mary Jane's request rode heavy on his shoulders as he mounted up and headed for the solitude of his cabin. Boone's horse picked its way along the narrow trail leading to his line shack, hooves crunching on frost-touched leaves. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines, but Boone barely noticed the familiar beauty. His mind kept returning to Mary Jane Thatcher's unexpected proposal, turning it over and over like a strange stone found in a creek bed. The line shack came into view, a humble structure of rough-hewn logs that had been his refuge these past 5 years. Smoke from the morning's fire still curled from the chimney, thin and blue against the autumn sky. His dog-eared Bible sat where he'd left it on the table by the window, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Lately, though, he'd found himself unable to open it, the weight of his past making the good book's messages of forgiveness feel somehow out of reach. Boone unsaddled his horse and saw to its needs, each familiar task accompanied by memories he'd rather forget. The crack of rifles, the smoke of burning lodges, the cries of women and children fleeing across the snow. He'd been an army scout then, leading soldiers to tribal camps. He'd told himself he was just following orders, but that excuse had grown hollow with the years. Inside the shack, Boone built up the fire and set coffee to boil, though he knew he wouldn't drink it. His eyes kept straying to the Bible, remembering the passages about redemption he once knew by heart. But what redemption could there be for a man who'd helped destroy so many lives? The coffee bubbled over, filling the small room with its bitter smell. Boone moved it off the heat, decision suddenly clear in his mind. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, but he could help protect what Mary Jane was trying to preserve, not just her ranch, but the promise made to the Ute family who depended on that winter grazing land. The sun was westering when Boone rode up to the Thatcher ranch. He found Mary Jane in the yard, struggling with 2 heavy water buckets. Without a word, he dismounted and took them from her, carrying them to the waiting wash tub. Together they made several more trips to the well, working in a silence that felt almost comfortable. When the chore was done, Mary Jane wiped her hands on her apron. "There's stew keeping warm on the stove," she said simply. "Enough for 2. The kitchen was neat but lived in, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a cat dozing by the cook stove. Mary Jane lit the lamp and served up 2 bowls of rabbit stew, the rich smell filling the small room. They ate in silence for a while, the clink of spoons against crockery the only sound. Finally, Mary Jane set down her spoon. "I reckon I owe you the full story," she said, her voice steady. "Thomas signed a contract with the railroad for water rights. Good money, fair terms, except for one clause we didn't study close enough." She reached for a folded paper in her apron pocket. "It says the agreement is only valid if the property is maintained by a married householder. If the owner becomes widowed, they have 48 hours to remarry, or the railroad can claim the whole ranch for breach of contract." Boone's hand tightened on his spoon. "That's a mighty particular clause." Thomas never thought it would matter. Mary Jane's voice caught slightly. "He was young, healthy. We both thought we had years ahead." She straightened her shoulders. "But here we are, and I mean to keep this land, Mr. Taggart. Not just for myself, but for the promises we made. That Ute family has wintered their horses in our north pasture for 15 years. We gave our word they'd always have that right." The lamplight was growing dim, shadows deepening in the corners of the kitchen. Boone studied Mary Jane's face, seeing not desperation but a quiet, unshakable determination. She wasn't begging for help. She was offering him a chance to be part of something honorable. He thought of his Bible back at the line shack, of all the passages about redemption he'd been too ashamed to read. Maybe this was what forgiveness looked like, not grand gestures or dramatic changes, but simple choices to do what was right. "I'll marry you," he said quietly. Mary Jane's hands, which had been twisting a corner of her apron, grew still. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" Boone nodded. A marriage of convenience to protect the land and keep promises made. He met her eyes across the table. "I reckon those are good enough reasons. People will talk," she warned. "Let them." His voice was gentle but firm. Some things matter more than talk. Mary Jane stood and began clearing the dishes, her movements precise and controlled. But Boone saw the slight tremor in her hands, the relief she was trying to hide. He rose to help her, and together they worked in the dimming lamplight. Two people brought together by circumstance but united in purpose. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft rose and gold as Boone guided his horse alongside Mary Jane's wagon. The morning air held an autumn crispness, their breath visible in small clouds. Mary Jane sat straight on the wagon seat, her black morning dress exchanged for a serviceable brown wool, her face set with quiet determination. "We should stop by Naomi's camp first," Mary Jane said, adjusting her bonnet against the morning sun. "She needs to know about this arrangement." Boone's shoulders tensed at the mention of the Ute elder, but he nodded. The trail to the creek wound through stands of aspen, their leaves trembling gold in the morning light. As they approached the camp, smoke from cooking fires rose straight in the still air. Naomi stood waiting, as if she'd known they were coming. Her silver hair was braided neatly, her dark eyes sharp as she watched their approach. Several children peeked out from behind a nearby lodge, curious but shy. Mary Jane climbed down from the wagon, greeting the elder with a respectful nod. "Naomi, I've come to tell you about a change." "I heard about your loss," Naomi said, her voice gentle. "The creek carried your tears to us." Boone remained mounted, his hat pulled low, but Naomi's gaze found him anyway. He forced himself to meet her eyes, though shame burned in his chest. How many camps like this had he helped destroy? How many elders like Naomi had he helped displace? Mary Jane explained the situation: her husband's death, the railroad's contract, the rushed marriage. Naomi listened without interruption, only the slight narrowing of her eyes showing her concern. "The railroad men, they speak with forked tongues," Naomi said when Mary Jane finished. "But you, Mary Jane, your words have always been straight." She disappeared into her lodge, returning with a leather tube. "This belonged to my grandfather, the treaty that speaks of our rights to the winter waters." Mary Jane accepted the tube carefully. "I'll keep it safe." Naomi turned to Boone then, studying him. He wanted to look away but didn't. "You carried much darkness," she said finally. "But today you choose to protect rather than destroy. This is good medicine." From within her shawl, she produced a small bundle of sage. "For blessing," she said, handing it to Mary Jane. "May your union bring peace to troubled waters." The sun was climbing higher when they finally reached town. The street was busy with morning traffic, wagons delivering goods, ranchers in for supplies, children heading to school. Mary Jane guided the wagon to the clerk's office, while Boone tied his horse at the rail. But the clerk's office was locked, a hastily scrawled note on the door. "Called away on urgent business. Back tomorrow." "Railroad business, I'd wager," Mary Jane said quietly, her fingers tightening on the leather tube holding the treaty. Boone studied the empty street, his jaw set. "We can't wait. The deadline's at sundown." "The preacher," Mary Jane suggested. "Reverend Wilson has known me since I was a girl." They found Reverend Wilson in his study behind the church, reading his Bible in a patch of sunlight. He looked up in surprise at their entrance, his spectacles catching the light. "Mary Jane? I wasn't expecting—" His voice trailed off as he took in their serious expressions. Mary Jane explained their situation, her voice steady despite the urgency. The preacher listened, his weathered face growing troubled. "A marriage should be entered into with proper reflection and preparation," he said slowly. "And so soon after Thomas." "Sometimes circumstances don't allow for proper timing," Boons spoke up, his deep voice gentle but firm. "But protecting the land and keeping promises, those seem like good foundations for a marriage." Reverend Wilson removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "The railroad has many friends in high places," he said carefully. "They won't take kindly to being outmaneuvered." "We're not asking you to take sides against the railroad," Mary Jane said, "just to help us do what's right." The preacher was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "Come back at dusk. We'll do it proper, with rings and witnesses, but quietly." As the sun settled toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the church's stained glass windows, Mary Jane and Boone stood before the altar. Two of the preacher's family members served as witnesses, their faces solemn in the candlelight. The ceremony was brief but dignified. When Boone slipped the simple gold band onto Mary Jane's finger, his mother's ring, carried in his pocket all these years, his large hands were surprisingly gentle. Mary Jane's answering "I do" was clear and unwavering. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Reverend Wilson pronounced, closing his Bible softly. In the gathering darkness outside the church, Mary Jane paused beside the wagon. "Thank you," she said simply. Boone touched the brim of his hat. "We'd best get home before full dark." They rode back in silence, the first stars appearing overhead, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. The moon cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Boone and Mary Jane returned from their wedding. Cricket songs filled the cool night air, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Mary Jane's hands were steady as she unhitched the wagon horses, while Boone tended to his mount. "I can manage the morning chores," she said, breaking their comfortable silence. "You should ride back to your line shack, get what you need." Boone nodded, his broad shoulders outlined in the moonlight. "I'll return before noon." Sleep came fitfully to Mary Jane that night, her mind churning with thoughts of paperwork and railroad men. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with frost silvering the fence rails. She had just finished the milking when hoofbeats announced visitors. Mr. Garwood sat astride a sleek bay horse, his city clothes pristine despite the dusty ride. Beside him, Deputy Mills looked uncomfortable on his dappled mare, his badge catching the morning sun. "Mrs. Thatcher," Garwood called out, his voice smooth as creek ice. "Or should I say, Mrs. Taggart?" Mary Jane set down her milk pail carefully. "State your business, Mr. Garwood." The lawyer dismounted with practiced grace, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "I'm afraid there's an irregularity with your hasty arrangement." He pulled a document from his leather satchel. "According to statute, a marriage isn't legally binding until properly recorded by the town clerk." Heavy hoofbeats announced Boons' arrival. He rode in fast, pulling his horse up sharp when he saw the visitors. His face darkened as he recognized Garwood. "Now, Mr. Taggart," Garwood said, raising a placating hand. "Let's keep this civil. I'm simply pointing out that without the clerk's official record, this marriage has no legal standing, which means, unfortunately, the inheritance clause remains unfulfilled." Boone swung down from his horse, his movements deliberate, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You arranged for the clerk to disappear." "The clerk's whereabouts are hardly my concern," Garwood replied smoothly. "I merely represent the railroad's interests in ensuring all legal requirements are properly met." Mary Jane stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Boone's arm. The muscles there were tight as saddle leather. "We'll ride into town right now," she said firmly. "Get this recorded proper." Garwood's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, though I hear the clerk may be away on urgent business for several days. Family emergency, I believe." "Several days?" Boone's voice was dangerous and low. "The deadline's tomorrow at sundown." The deputy shifted in his saddle, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "Indeed," Garwood agreed. "And without a legal male head of household by then, well—" He shrugged expressively. "The railroad's claim takes precedence. Nothing personal, you understand? Just business." Boone took a step forward, but Mary Jane's grip on his arm tightened. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention," she said evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to attend to." They watched in tense silence as Garwood and the deputy rode away. Once they were out of sight, Boone turned to Mary Jane, his face tight with anger. "We can't let them steal your land through paper tricks." Mary Jane's mind was already working, calculating options. "We need to think this through careful," she said. "Let's get inside." Over coffee at her kitchen table, Boone proposed his plan. "Sunday service," he said. "We have the preacher announce our marriage before the whole congregation. Plenty of witnesses, all respectable folk." Mary Jane shook her head slowly. "Sunday's 3 days away. The railroad won't wait that long." She traced the rim of her coffee cup thoughtfully. "Garwood's too clever to leave us that opening. He'll move before then." "Then we ride to the next county," Boone suggested. "Find another clerk." 2 days' hard ride each way, Mary Jane counted. We'd never make it before the deadline. She stood and walked to the window, watching the morning sun glint off the creek that had sustained her family for so long. "Less than 24 hours now. That's all we've got." Boone joined her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring despite their predicament. "We'll find a way," he said quietly. "I promise you that." Mary Jane turned to face him, noting how the morning light softened his weathered features. "I believe you," she said. "But we need to be smart about this. Garwood's got the law tied up in knots, but there might be another way." They spent the next hour planning, their coffee growing cold as they considered and discarded various options. The morning sun climbed higher, marking the precious hours slipping away, while somewhere in town a clerk remained conveniently absent and a railroad lawyer waited patiently for his scheme to bear fruit. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Mary Jane and Boone sat at her worn kitchen table, sketching out their plan. A pot of coffee steamed between them, untouched. "If we can't wait for Sunday service," Mary Jane said, "we'll bring the witnesses here." Her finger traced a route on the rough map they'd drawn. "There's 12 homesteads within riding distance." Boone nodded slowly. Preacher Morrison agreed to come at first light. His deep voice carried a note of determination. "We'll need as many respectable folk as we can gather. Even the ones who turned their backs at John's funeral." Mary Jane's voice held no bitterness, just practical acceptance. "We need them all." They hitched up the wagon as the sun began its westward slide. Mary Jane packed bread and cheese, knowing the journey ahead would be long. Boone helped her up onto the wagon seat, his strong hands gentle, before climbing up beside her. The first stop was the Henderson place. Sarah Henderson listened with pressed lips as Mary Jane explained their predicament, but finally nodded. "We'll be there," she said stiffly, "though I don't approve of such hasty arrangements." Stop after stop, they made their way across the countryside. Some welcomed them warmly, like the Wilsons, who immediately promised to bring their whole family. Others, like old Mrs. Blackwood, barely opened their doors but grudgingly agreed to attend. The sun had long since set when they reached the last homestead. Stars wheeled overhead, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage. Both were exhausted, the wagon's steady creaking a constant companion on their return journey. 14 families, Mary Jane said, checking her list by lantern light. Plus the preacher. That should be enough witnesses to satisfy any court." Boone was quiet for a long moment, his face shadowed in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with memory. "There's something else that might help. Something I never told anyone." Mary Jane turned to look at him, noting the tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" "Remember that treaty document Naomi showed us, the one about the creek rights?" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm the reason she has it." The wagon wheels creaked through a rocky patch before he continued. "Years ago, when I was an Army scout, we raided a Ute camp." His voice grew rough with shame. "I saw papers burning in a fire. Don't know what made me do it, but I pulled them out, kept them safe, though I couldn't read the Indian agent's writing." Mary Jane listened silently, understanding the weight of his confession. "Later, I found Naomi's family. Gave them the papers without saying where they came from." His hands tightened on the reins. "That treaty proves the creek can't be dammed or diverted. The railroad's plans would violate it." "You saved something precious," Mary Jane said softly. "Something that protects both our people's rights to the water." Boone's laugh was bitter. "After helping destroy their camp? Doesn't make up for what I did?" Mary Jane reached over and placed her hand over his on the reins. "You were a different man then. The choices you've made since, helping Naomi's family, agreeing to marry me to protect the land, that's who you are now." The wagon rolled on through the darkness, its wheels cutting fresh tracks in the dusty road. Boone's shoulders gradually relaxed under Mary Jane's steady presence. "Sometimes," she continued, "the Lord gives us chances to make things right. Maybe this is yours." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the stars bright overhead. Finally, Boone spoke again, his voice stronger. "Reckon you might be right about that." The ranch house came into view, a dark shape against the star-filled sky. As they unhitched the horses, Mary Jane could see dawn wasn't far off. Their witnesses would arrive in just a few hours, and with them, hope for saving both her land and Boone's conscience. "Get some rest," she told him as they finished the evening chores. "Tomorrow we fight for what's right, together." Boone nodded, a small smile softening his weathered features. "Together," he agreed, and in that one word was a promise that went beyond their marriage of convenience. As Mary Jane prepared for bed, she thought about the man she'd married, not just the quiet strength everyone saw, but the deep well of conscience that had led him to save those treaty papers years ago. Whatever tomorrow brought, she knew she'd chosen well. Dawn broke harsh and bitter over Mary Jane's ranch, the wind whipping across the yard with unusual force for the season. Dust devils danced between the barn and the house as the first wagon approached, wheels creaking against the morning quiet. Mary Jane stood on her porch, wrapped in her best shawl, watching as more neighbors began arriving. The Hendersons came first, their wagon packed tight with all 7 children dressed in their Sunday best. Sarah Henderson's lips were still pressed in that disapproving line, but she'd kept her word. "Mighty kind of you to come," Mary Jane called out, forcing warmth into her voice despite the chill reception. One by one, more wagons and riders appeared. The Wilsons brought extra chairs. Old Mrs. Blackwood arrived, perched primly in her son's buggy, her grey hair tucked severely beneath her bonnet. Even the McDaniels, who hadn't spoken to Mary Jane since John's passing, drove up in their weathered buckboard. Boone emerged from the barn, his usual quiet presence somehow more pronounced in his clean shirt and pressed trousers. He nodded to each arrival, but Mary Jane noticed how his shoulders tensed as the yard filled with people. More than 20 settlers now milled about, some clustering in whispered conversation, others openly staring at the unlikely couple. "They're here to help," Mary Jane reminded him softly as she passed, carrying a pitcher of water to the table they'd set up. The sound of horses drew everyone's attention to the eastern path. Naomi and her family approached on their paint ponies, their arrival causing a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, but Mary Jane walked forward to greet them with genuine warmth. "Welcome, friends," she said, reaching up to clasp Naomi's hand as the elder woman dismounted. Naomi's dark eyes crinkled with kindness. "We stand with you," she said simply, her family gathering behind her at the edge of the crowd. Boon's gaze met Naomi's briefly, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a shared prayer for redemption. He moved to stand near their group, finding comfort in their dignified silence amid the buzzing whispers of the settlers. Preacher Morrison arrived last, his Bible tucked under one arm. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern hills as he called everyone to gather. Mary Jane and Boone stood before him, facing each other as they had in the church 2 days before. "We are gathered here," the preacher began, his voice carrying across the yard, "to witness before God and this community the blessing of this marriage between Boone Taggart and Mary Jane Thatcher." The wind caught at Mary Jane's skirts as she listened to the familiar words. Boone's large hands were warm around hers, steady and sure. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, and she saw in his eyes the same quiet strength that had first given her hope. "Do you, Boone Taggart, reaffirm your commitment?" The ceremony continued, witnessed by the mixed gathering of settlers and Ute alike. Even the most skeptical neighbors seemed moved by the solemnity of the moment. Mrs. Blackwood dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Sarah Henderson's stern expression softened slightly. Just as Preacher Morrison raised his hands for the final blessing, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Mr. Garwood rode up in his polished buggy, a deputy at his side. The lawyer's face wore its usual mask of cold civility as he stepped down, brushing dust from his fine coat. "I hate to interrupt this touching scene," he said, his voice carrying a note of false regret. "But I'm afraid this entire proceeding is meaningless." He pulled a document from his breast pocket, the paper crackling in the wind. Mary Jane felt Boone's hands tighten around hers. The gathered crowd shifted, drawing closer to hear. "This injunction," Garwood continued, "signed by Judge Parker himself, declares your marriage invalid due to multiple procedural defects." His thin smile didn't reach his eyes. The original ceremony was not properly witnessed or recorded, and this, he gestured dismissively at the gathering, this theatrical display carries no legal weight. "We have witnesses," Mary Jane protested, her voice strong despite the fear clutching at her heart. "More than 20 good people who arrived too late," Garwood cut in smoothly. "The deadline for establishing a legal male head of household has already passed. The railroad will take possession of this property at noon tomorrow." He handed the injunction to the deputy. "Please ensure Mrs. Thatcher receives proper notice." The deputy, looking uncomfortable, stepped forward to deliver the paper. Boone moved as if to intercept him, but Mary Jane squeezed his hand, silently asking him to wait. The gathered neighbors burst into concerned murmurs. Naomi's family remained silent, but their presence seemed to grow stronger, like a wall of support at Mary Jane's back. The wind picked up again, sending the injunction fluttering in Mary Jane's hands as she read the damning legal language. "Noon tomorrow," Garwood repeated, climbing back into his buggy. "I suggest you begin packing, Mrs. Thatcher." He emphasized her maiden name with subtle cruelty before driving away, leaving a cloud of dust and dismay in his wake. The morning's hopeful gathering had turned sour, the blessing transformed into a bitter reminder of their precarious situation. Their witnesses stood frozen, uncertain whether to offer comfort or take their leave, while the cold wind continued to whip across the ranch yard, carrying with it the scent of approaching trouble. The evening sun cast long shadows across Mary Jane's kitchen as she set out bowls of steaming bean stew. Naomi sat at the worn table, her weathered hands folded carefully in her lap, while her grandson Thomas stood near the window, his keen eyes scanning the darkening yard. Boone occupied his usual spot by the door, his large frame somehow making the chair seem smaller than usual. No one spoke as Mary Jane placed the last bowl on the table. The weight of tomorrow's deadline hung heavy in the air, mixing with the rich aroma of cornbread and coffee. There may be a way, Naomi finally said, breaking the silence. She reached into the folds of her shawl and withdrew a carefully wrapped package. This document speaks of promises made long ago. Boone's shoulders tensed as Naomi unwrapped the treaty. The yellowed paper bore water stains and scorched edges, but the official seal remained clear. Mary Jane leaned closer, her eyes widening as she recognized the significance. This treaty establishes our people's right to the creek waters, Naomi explained, her finger tracing the carefully preserved text. But more importantly, it speaks of shared stewardship with those who marry into families holding ancestral claims. Mary Jane looked up sharply. Our marriage? Yes, Naomi nodded. Your union with Boone, who once protected this very document, creates a bridge between our peoples. The railroad cannot simply dismiss such connections. Boone's face had grown pale. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he stared at the treaty. I remember that night, he said, his voice rough with memory. The camp was burning. I found this in a chest, didn't know what it was, but couldn't let it burn. You saved more than paper. Thomas spoke up from his post by the window. You saved our family's voice. Mary Jane reached across the table, placing her hand over Boone's. And now it might save our home. The county seat holds copies of all treaties, Thomas continued. If we can get this verified before noon tomorrow, it would create a legal claim that even the railroad's lawyers can't ignore. The county seat's a 6-hour ride, Boone said, calculation replacing the guilt in his eyes. I can make it by midnight, Thomas replied. The clerk there knows me. He's honest, won't be bought like the one in town. Boone stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. I'm riding with you. Boone, Mary Jane started, concern etching her features. I need to do this, he said softly, meeting her eyes. Need to make it right. Naomi rose as well, her presence commanding despite her small stature. The night will be cold. I have medicines for the horses to keep them strong. While Thomas and Naomi prepared the horses, Mary Jane helped Boone gather what he'd need for the ride. In their bedroom, she packed extra shells for his rifle and wrapped bread and dried meat in a clean cloth. I'll be back by dawn, Boone promised, buckling his gun belt. Whatever it takes. Mary Jane straightened his collar, her hands lingering on his chest. I know you will. Outside, Thomas had already mounted his paint pony, the treaty secured safely in his saddlebags. Naomi stood beside him, speaking quiet words in their native tongue while pressing a small pouch of herbs into his hands. Boone swung up onto his own horse, checking his rifle in its scabbard. The night wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain as the two men prepared to ride out. The treaty knows its protector, Naomi said, looking up at Boone. It has waited all these years to return your kindness. Boone ducked his head, emotion tightening his throat. I'm much obliged for your trust. He managed. Mary Jane stepped forward, touching his leg. Ride safe, she whispered. With a final nod to the women, Boone and Thomas urged their horses forward. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the gathering darkness as Mary Jane and Naomi watched them disappear down the trail towards the county seat. Come, Naomi said gently, taking Mary Jane's arm. We have our own work to do preparing for tomorrow. Mary Jane allowed herself to be led back inside, but her heart rode with the men into the night, carrying their hopes for salvation with them. Behind her, the kitchen lamp burned steady and bright, a beacon for their return at dawn. The night wind bit cold through their coats as Boone and Thomas rode eastward. Their horses' hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the hard-packed trail, while overhead, stars wheeled in a cloudless sky. The moon cast just enough light to mark their path through the rolling hills. Boone's mount snorted, steam rising from its flanks in the chill air. They'd been riding hard for nearly 3 hours, making good time despite the darkness. Beside him, Thomas sat his paint pony with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. Post station should be just beyond that rise," Thomas said, pointing to a dark ridge against the stars. "My uncle keeps fresh horses there." Boone nodded, grateful for the young man's knowledge. In all his years of solitude, he'd forgotten how much easier tasks became with trusted help. The thought stirred memories of countless lonely nights in his line shack, with only his Bible and his regrets for company. The post station emerged from the darkness, a low adobe building with a small corral. A single lamp burned in the window, and as they approached, a door creaked open. An older Ute man stepped out, raising a hand in greeting. "Thomas?" the man called softly. "I received your message from the runner. Fresh horses are ready." While they transferred their saddles to the waiting mounts, Boone noticed how Thomas and his uncle spoke, in quick, quiet Ute, their gestures speaking as much as their words. It reminded him of the families he'd once watched from afar during his scouting days, before the violence, before the shame that drove him to isolation. "My uncle says the moon will light our path all the way to the county seat," Thomas said as they mounted up. "We should make good time." The fresh horses moved eagerly beneath them as they set out again. The miles passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft sounds of leather and hoofbeats. Boone found himself studying his companion's profile in the moonlight, seeing not just a young man, but a bridge between worlds, much like the treaty they carried. "You remind me of someone," Boone said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "A young brave I knew, years back, before the Troubles. He had that same way of reading the land." Thomas turned slightly in his saddle. "My father," he said simply. "He died resisting the railroad's first push through our hunting grounds." Boone's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," he managed. "The past is past," Thomas replied, but his voice held no bitterness. "What matters is how we choose to walk forward." The words settled deep in Boone's heart as they rode on through the night. Perhaps that was what Mary Jane had seen in him, not just a means to save her ranch, but someone else seeking a new path. Dawn was just breaking when they reached the county seat, their horses lathered despite the cold. The street lay quiet as they dismounted in front of the courthouse, but a light already burned in the registrar's office. The county registrar, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up in surprise as they entered. His eyes widened further when Thomas carefully laid out the treaty on his desk. "This is—" The registrar adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to examine the document. "This is the original Ute Water Rights Treaty from 1858. Where did you—" "It's been in my grandmother's keeping," Thomas explained. "We need official certification of its validity." The registrar ran his fingers carefully along the edges of the paper. "This is absolutely legitimate. The seal, the signatures, all authentic. But proper certification will take at least a week. There's a process, you understand." Boone stepped forward, his shadow falling across the desk. "We don't have a week. The railroad's moving to seize land at noon today. We need something official now." I dot. The registrar looked up at Boone's imposing figure. "I suppose I could telegraph an acknowledgement of the treaty's existence and apparent authenticity. It wouldn't be final certification, but it could serve as grounds for temporary stay of action." "Do it," Boone said firmly. They watched as the registrar composed the telegraph, his pencil scratching across the paper. After several minutes, he rose and put on his coat. "I'll take this to the telegraph office myself. Wait here." When the registrar returned 20 minutes later, he handed Thomas a receipt for the telegram. "This confirms the message was sent. It's not much, but it's legal evidence that the treaty is under official review." Boone and Thomas exchanged glances. It would have to be enough. The sun had cleared the eastern hills as they mounted their tired horses for the journey home. Boone's body ached from the night's ride, but a new lightness filled his chest. Beside him, Thomas smiled faintly as he tucked the telegraph receipt safely away. "We should make it back before noon," Thomas said, turning his horse westward. Boone nodded, thinking of Mary Jane waiting at the ranch. They had their foothold now, small perhaps, but legal. As they rode into the morning light, the lonely years seemed to fall away behind him like shadows at dawn. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mary Jane's ranch as she moved with purpose through her daily tasks. Her hand stayed busy, but her mind wandered to Boone and Thomas, hoping they'd found success at the county seat. The familiar rhythm of ranch work helped steady her nerves as she waited. She paused at the water trough, watching the chickens scratch in the dusty yard. Everything looked so ordinary, yet nothing felt normal. The ranch had been her home for 20 years, through joy and heartbreak. Now its fate hung by a thread. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, adjusting her apron before heading toward the barn. Inside, she organized supplies and important papers, tucking them safely away in case things turned ugly. The deed to the ranch, her marriage certificate from the preacher, and her late husband's letters, all carefully stored in an old leather satchel. As the sun began its westward slide, Mary Jane hitched up her wagon and drove into town. The streets were unusually quiet, but she felt the weight of watching eyes behind curtained windows. Whispers followed her progress down the main street. "Did you hear? Married that scarred-up Taggart fellow right after poor Thomas was buried." Never knew Mary Jane to be so brazen. Must be desperate, taking up with a man like that. Mary Jane held her head high, though the words stung. These same people had shared her table at church socials, had brought food when Thomas fell ill. Now they turned on her like weather vanes in a storm. The church stood silent at the edge of town, its white painted boards gleaming in the afternoon light. Inside, she found Reverend Matthews organizing his Sunday texts. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Taggart, what brings you here?" "Reverend, I need you to stand witness when the telegram arrives," Mary Jane said, her voice steady. "The one confirming our legal right to the land." The preacher set down his Bible, his expression troubled. "There's been talk in town." "I imagine there has," Mary Jane replied. "But you married us proper, and you know the truth of it." "Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, I do. And I'll stand witness, though it might not make me popular with certain parties." "Thank you, Reverend. That's all I ask." The sun was setting when Mary Jane returned to the ranch, painting the hills in shades of amber and rose. She had just finished securing the horses when the sound of approaching riders drew her attention. 3 men rode up to the gate. In the lead was Victor Thatcher, her brother-in-law, sitting his horse with the smug confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. Behind him, 2 rough-looking men she didn't recognize watched her with cold eyes. "Mary Jane," Victor called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "I hope you're well. What do you want, Victor?" She stood her ground as they dismounted. Victor pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat. "Just doing my duty to the family name. Can't have you throwing away Thomas's legacy on some desperate scheme." "Thomas's legacy is safe with me," Mary Jane said. "As his wife. Widow," Victor cut in, "and now supposedly married to that recluse, Taggart, though I hear the proper papers were never filed." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Be reasonable, Mary Jane. The railroad's offering good money, better than watching this place fall apart under a woman's care." Mary Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "The ranch isn't for sale, Victor. Not to you, not to the railroad." "Then you leave me no choice." He thrust the papers toward her. "These are legal eviction notices. You have until noon tomorrow to clear out, or my men here will help you pack." The hired men shifted their weight, making sure she saw the guns on their hips. "You have no right," Mary Jane said. "I have every right," Victor snapped. "As Thomas's only male heir, with you being improperly married. The law's clear on this." Mary Jane squared her shoulders, thinking of Boone and Thomas riding through the night to secure their claim. "The law isn't as clear as you think, Victor. And you're not welcome here." Victor's face darkened. "Don't be foolish, Mary Jane. Women like you shouldn't try to play at men's business. Pack your things tonight. It'll be easier that way." "I'll wait for my husband," she said firmly. "Suit yourself." Victor mounted up, the threat clear in his voice. "But come noon tomorrow, this ranch belongs to me, and your precious second marriage won't change that." Mary Jane watched them ride away, their horses kicking up dust in the gathering dusk. Only when they disappeared beyond the ridge did she allow her hands to shake. She looked toward the eastern horizon, where the first stars were appearing. "Hurry home, Boone," she whispered. "Hurry home." The oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the parlor as Mary Jane sat in her rocking chair, her mother's quilted shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The tick of the mantel clock marked each passing minute like a hammer on her nerves. When heavy boots stomped onto the porch, she didn't flinch. Victor burst through the door without knocking, his 2 hired men crowding the doorway behind him. Their rough faces looked even more menacing in the amber lamplight. "Still here, I see," Victor said, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness. "And where's that husband of yours? Run off already?" Mary Jane's hand stayed steady in her lap. "My husband is conducting legal business on behalf of this ranch." Victor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "Legal business? That's rich, coming from a woman who married a man with blood on his hands." He paced the room, running a finger along the mantelpiece. What would Thomas think, seeing his wife throw herself at the town outcast? Thomas would be ashamed to see his own brother trying to steal his widow's home. Mary Jane replied, her voice firm. Victor's face reddened. "Steal? I'm protecting the Thatcher legacy. This land needs a man's hand, not some desperate widow's schemes." He leaned close, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You're disgracing our family name with this charade. The only disgrace here is your greed, Victor." Mary Jane stood, matching his gaze. "This ranch is my home. I won't be bullied out of it." One of the hired men stepped forward, hand resting on his gun belt. "Mom, might be best if you started packing now. Save everybody trouble come morning." Before Mary Jane could respond, the crunch of wagon wheels sounded outside. Through the window she saw lantern light approaching. Her heart lifted as familiar silhouettes emerged from the darkness. Naomi stepped through the door first, her silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. Behind her came Thomas's mother and sisters, then the preacher's wife, and even Mrs. Henderson from the general store. More shapes moved in the yard, at least a dozen townspeople gathering in the night. Victor's enforcers shifted uncomfortably as the silent witnesses filled the room. Naomi moved to stand beside Mary Jane, her presence as solid as a mountain. "What's this?" Victor demanded, his confidence cracking. "Some kind of circus?" "This is community," Mary Jane said quietly. "Something you wouldn't understand." Naomi's dark eyes fixed on Victor. "We stand with those who honor the land and their word." Her English was clear and strong. "This place knows its true keeper." Victor's hand clenched around his hat brim. "You can't stop the law. I'll be back at noon tomorrow with marshals. Then we'll see how much your community matters." He jammed his hat back on and stormed out, his men following quickly behind. The thunder of hooves marked their retreat into the darkness. The gathered women stayed, bringing food and coffee, sharing quiet words of support. Mary Jane felt tears prick her eyes at their kindness, but she held them back. There would be time for crying later. As midnight approached, most returned to their homes, but Naomi and her family remained. They kept vigil through the long hours, speaking softly in their own language, a prayer-like rhythm that brought peace to Mary Jane's troubled heart. Sleep refused to come. Mary Jane moved through the house like a ghost, straightening things that didn't need straightening, watching the stars wheel overhead through the kitchen window. Her faith in Boone never wavered, but fear gnawed at her belly. What if the County Registar wouldn't help? What if the telegram didn't arrive in time? The first grey light of dawn was seeping into the sky when she heard it, the steady drumming of hooves. Her heart leapt as 2 riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. Boone dismounted before his horse fully stopped, his spurs jingling as he strode toward her. Despite riding all night, his eyes were bright with triumph. Thomas followed, grinning broadly as he pulled a yellow paper from his jacket. "We got it," Boone said, gathering Mary Jane in his arms. His voice was hoarse with exhaustion, but proud. The registrar sent the telegram himself. The treaties recognized, legal and binding. Mary Jane pressed her face into his dusty coat, breathing in the scent of horse and leather and hope. When she looked up, Naomi stood nearby, smiling as Thomas handed her the telegram. "The Creator works in circles," Naomi said, holding the precious paper. "What was broken begins to heal." Boone's arm tightened around Mary Jane as the sun crested the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold. They had their proof now. They had their chance. And they had each other. Dawn painted the town's main street in shades of gold and purple as Boone and Mary Jane rode in, their wagon wheels creaking through the morning quiet. The telegram lay safely in Mary Jane's reticule, its yellow paper carrying the weight of their hopes. Shop owners swept their porches, pausing to watch the couple pass. News of Victor's ultimatum had spread like wildfire through the small community. The sheriff's office sat squat and grey beside the general store, its windows reflecting the rising sun. Inside, Sheriff Mills hunched over his desk, coffee cup in hand. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Mighty early for social calls," he said, setting down his cup. Boone stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow across the desk. "This ain't social, Sheriff. We've got legal proof that needs your attention." Mary Jane withdrew the telegram, smoothing its creases before placing it on the desk. "The County Registar confirmed our treaty rights. The railroad can't seize our land." Sheriff Mills picked up the paper, squinting at the typed message. His fingers drummed against his desk while he read. "This is interesting, but the railroad's lawyers—" "The railroad don't trump treaty rights," Boone interrupted, his voice low but firm. "And you know it." The sheriff's chair creaked as he leaned back. "Look, folks, I sympathize. But there's powerful interests at work here. My hands are—" "Then let the town decide," Boone said. "We demand a public hearing, right now, before Victor returns with his false claims." Mary Jane stepped closer, her skirts rustling. "Sheriff Mills, you've known me since Thomas and I first homesteaded here. You know what's right." The sheriff's gaze shifted between them and the telegram. Morning light streamed through the window, highlighting the doubt on his face. "A public hearing won't change the railroad's plans." "Maybe not," Mary Jane said softly. "But it will show where this community stands." A knock at the door made them all turn. Preacher Davidson stood in the doorway, his Bible tucked under one arm. "I couldn't help but overhear. The churchyard would be a fitting place for such a hearing." The sheriff's mustache twitched. "Preacher, this is a legal matter." "It's a matter of conscience," the preacher interrupted. "And those belong to God and community both." He stepped into the office, his presence filling the small space. "The morning bell can summon the townsfolk. Let truth be spoken in the light of day." Sheriff Mills stood slowly, adjusting his gun belt. "You realize this won't stop Victor's marshals when they come?" "No," Boone agreed, "but it'll make clear who stands for justice and who stands for greed." The sheriff studied them all for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine. 1 hour. But I'm keeping the peace. Nothing more." The preacher smiled. "That's all we ask, Sheriff. That and your witness." Outside, the morning had brightened. The preacher strode toward the church, his long legs carrying him quickly to the bell rope. Soon, the deep tones of the church bell rang out across the town, calling people from their homes and businesses. Mary Jane touched Boone's arm. "I should fetch Naomi. Her presence matters as much as the treaty." "Take the wagon," Boone said. "I'll help the preacher prepare." As Mary Jane drove toward the ranch, townspeople began gathering in the churchyard. Store owners closed their shops. Farmers paused their morning chores. Children ran ahead of their parents, excited by the unusual assembly. Boone and the preacher arranged wooden chairs in a rough circle on the grass. The sheriff stood apart, watching as the crowd grew. Railroad workers clustered together, their faces uncertain. The station master paced at the edge of the gathering, glancing nervously toward the telegraph office. When Mary Jane returned with Naomi and her family, the churchyard was full. The morning sun had burned away the dawn mist, leaving the air clear and warm. Naomi carried herself with quiet dignity, her dark eyes taking in the assembled faces. The preacher raised his hands for silence. "Friends and neighbors," his voice carried across the yard. "We are gathered to hear truth and witness justice. A telegram has arrived from the county seat concerning lands and rights that affect us all." Sheriff Mills stepped forward, holding the telegram. His voice was steady as he read the registrar's words, confirming the validity of the Wouldnt Treaty and its binding protection of the water rights on Mary Jane's ranch. A murmur ran through the crowd. The station master stepped forward, his face red. "But the railroad's purchase cannot override a federal treaty." Boone's deep voice cut through the noise. Those waters were protected long before the railroad came. Naomi rose, her silver hair gleaming. In clear English, she recounted the treaty's history, how it had been saved from destruction, and its meaning to both her people and the settlers who honored its terms. The churchyard grew quiet as she spoke. Even the sheriff's stance softened. The morning sun climbed higher, casting short shadows around the gathered townsfolk as they listened to truth being spoken in the light of day. The noon sun blazed overhead as more townspeople filed into the churchyard. Children perched on fence posts while their parents gathered in clusters, fanning themselves against the heat. Boone stood tall beside Mary Jane, his shadow falling across the worn grass. Naomi and Thomas remained close by, their presence a silent reminder of the land's deeper history. Preacher Davidson held the telegram high, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This document, received from the County Registar, confirms the validity of the Wouldnt Treaty and its binding protection of water rights on the Thatcher Ranch." Victor Thatcher pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "That piece of paper means nothing. The Thatcher estate dash." "You mean the estate you tried to sell behind your sister-in-law's back?" Boone's deep voice cut through the murmurs. He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket. "This here's a copy of a contract Victor signed with the railroad 3 months ago while Thomas was still alive." The crowd stirred. Mary Jane stepped forward, her voice steady despite her shock. "You sold our water rights without telling Thomas." "I found this in the county records while checking the treaty." Boone continued. "Victor here promised the railroad he'd ensure the land transferred to him after Thomas's passing, even guaranteed the creek would be clear for damming by summer's end." Gasps and whispers rippled through the gathering. Several townspeople stepped away from Victor, whose face had turned pale. "That's a lie!" Victor sputtered, but his eyes darted nervously. Mr. Garwood appeared at the edge of the churchyard, his suit pristine despite the dusty day. "Whatever Mr. Thatcher's arrangements, the railroad's claim stands. Progress cannot be impeded by— Let's put it to a vote." Boone interrupted, his voice carrying across the yard. "Right here, right now. Let the town decide if they stand with honest folks protecting their water or with those who'd sell out their own kin for profit." The preacher nodded solemnly. "A public showing of hands seems fitting. This affects all of us." Victor's face twisted with rage. "You can't let these people, Mary Jane said firmly, "are our neighbors, the ones who've shared our work, our worship, our lives. They deserve a say in what happens to our water." The crowd pressed closer, faces serious under the midday sun. Mr. Garwood adjusted his collar, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon him. Naomi stood straighter, her dignified presence a reminder of the treaty's deeper meaning. Tomas moved to stand beside Boone, bridging two worlds in silent solidarity. The churchyard hummed with tension as the preacher raised his hands for silence, preparing to call the vote that would decide not just the fate of the Thatcher Ranch, but the heart of their community. "All those in favor of supporting the Thatcher Ranch and the treaty rights, raise your hands." Preacher Davidson called out. Hands rose like wheat stalks in a summer breeze. First came the farmers from the North Valley, their calloused palms lifted high. Then the shopkeepers' wives, the smithy and his family, even the schoolteacher who usually stayed neutral in town disputes. Children raised their hands alongside their parents, creating a forest of support in the churchyard. Mr. Garwood's face tightened as he counted. More than 3/4 of the crowd stood against the railroad's claims. He tugged at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cooling afternoon breeze. "The people have spoken," Sheriff Mills declared, stepping forward. His badge caught the sunlight as he turned to face Victor and the railroad lawyer. "I hereby declare this eviction notice invalid until a proper court hearing can be held." He pulled the papers from Victor's grip and tore them in half. Victor's face twisted in fury. "You'll regret this, all of you!" He spun on his heel, nearly stumbling in his haste to leave. The crowd parted, some turning their backs as he stormed past. Mary Jane felt the tension leave her shoulders. She looked up at Boone, seeing the same relief in his eyes. Without hesitation, she stepped into his embrace. His arms wrapped around her, strong and sure, no longer just a legal shield, but a true partner's comfort. "Well now," Preacher Davidson said, smiling broadly. "Since we're all gathered here, seems fitting to give this union one final blessing, this time with the whole town as witness." The townspeople drew closer, forming a circle around Boone and Mary Jane. Naomi and Thomas stepped forward, offering a traditional blessing in their own tongue. The preacher raised his hands over the couple. "Lord, bless this marriage born of necessity but grown into love. Bless this land and the waters that sustain us all, and bless this community united in support of what's right and true." "Amen," the crowd echoed, their voices strong and clear. Mr. Garwood cleared his throat. "The railroad will need to review its position," he announced stiffly, before retreating through the church gate. Mary Jane squeezed Boone's hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against hers. Around them, neighbors stepped forward with handshakes and congratulations. Children scattered flower petals from the church garden. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold, blessing the scene with nature's own approval. Their marriage, once a desperate gambit, now stood witnessed and celebrated by the entire community. The land they'd fought to protect would remain a source of life for all, just as the treaty had intended. The evening sun painted long shadows across the Thatcher ranch as Mary Jane set out plates on the worn oak table. The day's victory had brought more than just legal security. It had brought family to their door. Naomi sat in the chair Mary Jane's husband had once occupied, her weathered hands folded peacefully in her lap. Thomas helped Boone bring in fresh water from the well, their earlier journey having forged a quiet understanding between them. Steam rose from the pot of rabbit stew Mary Jane had prepared, carrying with it the scent of sage and wild onions. The lamplight cast a warm glow over their faces as they shared the simple meal, the silence comfortable rather than strained. Boone's spoon paused halfway to his mouth as he watched Naomi break bread. Years ago, he had pulled that treaty from flames, never knowing it would become the key to their salvation. The memory of smoke and shouting had haunted him for so long, but now, sitting across from Naomi, he saw how a single act of mercy had rippled through time to protect not just Mary Jane's ranch, but the sacred waters that sustained them all. "The stars will be bright tonight," Naomi said, rising from the table. "A good sign for new beginnings." She gestured to Thomas, who nodded in understanding. They took their leave with dignified grace, Naomi touching Mary Jane's shoulder in blessing as they passed. After clearing the dishes, Mary Jane and Boone stepped out onto the porch. The evening air carried the sweet scent of prairie grass, and above them, the first stars pierced the darkening sky. Crickets played their evening song as the last light faded from the western horizon. "Thank you," Mary Jane said softly, "for choosing to stay, not just for the land, but for me." Boone turned to look at her, seeing in her eyes the same strength that had drawn him from his solitude that first day at the funeral. The memory of her bold proposal brought a gentle smile to his face. Mary Jane stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I buried my past yesterday, and I'll live with you today. Boon's rough hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. The ground beneath their feet felt solid now, their future no longer balanced on the edge of uncertainty. Together they stood, watching the stars multiply across the darkening sky, their shared silence filled with promise. The ranch that had once been a source of worry now felt like the foundation of something greater, a life built on redemption, strengthened by community, and blessed with shared purpose. The creek's gentle murmur seemed to echo their contentment, its waters flowing sure and steady into tomorrow. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.